All right, well, welcome
She is.
to Scars of War for Indochina, Scars of War in Indochina, I'm sorry. I am Lian Hang Ting Wen, the Dorothy Borg Associate Professor in the History of the United States and East Asia, Director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and co-founder, along with Professor John Phan there in the back, of Vietnamese Studies at Columbia. Courtesy of the Mac Family Gift for Global Vietnamese Studies, we are very proud to host this panel as part of our Legacies of the Vietnam War Conference, a marquee event of the 75th anniversary. We are actually, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute is 75 years old this year, and this is part of our anniversary series. But my co-organizers, Professor Tony Bui and Professor Hoàng Minh Vu, sitting there in the front, cannot take all the credit. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Columbia Journalism School, the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies, SIPA, Technology, Media, and Communications, and the New York Southeast Asian Network. I'm most grateful, though, to the Weatherhead staff, also known as my beloved work family, because without them, this event would not be possible. So before I begin and before I turn over the floor, I'd like to introduce the chair and moderator for this panel, Peter Osnos. Peter is the founder of the publishing house Public Affairs and former publisher of the Times book imprint at Random House, where he was previously a senior editor and associate publisher. Prior to his career in book publishing, Peter spent 18 years at the Washington Post, where he was correspondent in Moscow, London, and most importantly for this panel, Saigon. And he also served as foreign editor and national editor. He's the author of several books, including Would You Believe? The Helsinki Accords Changed the World, An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen, and the forthcoming LBJ McNamara, The Vietnam Partnership Destined to Fail, a book that I can't wait to read. Peter, take it away.
Wow, thank you. And the book is not for sale, but it would be if it was published. Thank you very much. I want you to know that I've gotten to know Hang over the course of the last year, and whenever I'm encountering Hang, I'm encountering a force of nature. It's extraordinary. And we're all very lucky to know her and very lucky to be involved with her institute. So, welcome. So I have a rather limited role, but I am the moderator. So I'm going to do my best to set things up. We're here, it's 50 years since the end of the war in Indochina. The period that is the more or less decade that the United States was most deeply involved is called in Indochina the American War. In fact, my sense of it, the wars in Indochina, the anti-colonial wars, basically started World War II and went through the early 80s. But the period of the American War is, for all kinds of obvious reasons, the one that Americans, in particular, focus on. All three countries, having endured a great deal, are at peace. All three of them have authoritarian governments with ideologies and economies designed primarily to keep power in the hands of the leadership class. The goal today is to describe the post-war consequences in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos through the personal perspectives of each of our panelists. So what we're going to do is ask each of them, in effect, to make a brief 10-minute presentation on the topic Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. I'm likely, when they're done with their 10 minutes, to exercise the prerogative of the presider and ask a question. I hope once they've done the three presentations that I can encourage a conversation among them, questions to each other, and then we'll come to you for your questions. Panel scheduled to end at 11:30. We could probably go 5 minutes over that, but then Hang would stand up and tell us it's over. So I want to start with Elizabeth. Okay. To my right. It's really, truly, you have to absorb this. I've known Elizabeth for over 50 years. We were both, believe it or not, reporters for the Washington Post in Indochina, Cambodia in particular for Elizabeth. Later, she worked as a reporter and editor at the New York Times. And she's written exceptional books, 2 in particular, after the war was over. The classic, literally, hands down, the classic, dealing with the Khmer Rouge years in the late 70s. And then a book called You Don't Belong Here, which was published actually by Public Affairs, which is a biographical portrait of the women journalists covering the Vietnam, Indochina War. A book which won, as I'm not mistaken, the Goldsmith Prize and various other prizes. 3 extraordinary women, 3 extraordinary biographies. We did persuade Elizabeth that the book was not an autobiography. So she talked about others, but really it's also about her. When you go to the Royale in Phnom Penh, or whatever it's called now.
It's the Royal.
Royal.
It's the English version there.
In the bar is Elizabeth Becker's press card over the bar. I mean, it is plaque with Elizabeth's press card. I asked Elizabeth to summarize the points she was making. So I'm going to actually summarize and read so that you can kind of get the sense of it. The United States has repeatedly rewritten its official history of the war and has refused to take responsibility for the damage it caused in its losing effort. The U.S. applied ever more draconian sanctions only to finally pivot towards the position of today with nary a word about reparations or their support for the Khmer Rouge after they were overthrown. And she says, this contrasts with the enormous amounts spent through the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. So Elizabeth passes judgment on how the U.S. has handled Vietnam since the end of the American War. George Black is also a distinguished journalist, and his latest book is The Long Reckoning, A Story of War, Peace, and Redemption in Vietnam, a New York Times notable book. They only choose 50, so out of thousands and thousands of books, that's considered as a distinction. The book examines how the U.S. was brought around to taking responsibility for the consequences of its war damage by a coalition of citizens, including American veterans, and how Vietnam now is willing to be in strategic partnership with the U.S., and this is my comment, holding off Chinese influence. Sera, get me right here,
Koulabdara.
good, close, left Laos as a child and is now the CEO of Legacies of War, an advocacy and educational organization working to address the impact of the war years in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia as well. She's especially focused on the deadly presence of UXO, which is unexploded ordnance, which amazingly 50 years after the fact, still killing people. So those are the 3, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, consequences. So let's start, Elizabeth, lean in.
Okay, no, I don't lean in. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. Peter, thank you for the nice summary. I don't know much else I have to say, but let me
10
start.
minutes worth.
I hope, yeah. I think some of you have been back to Vietnam and Cambodia since the war ended, maybe in the last 20 years or so. And if you have, I'm going to guess that you went in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, to the Museum of Remnants. Now, George is going to talk about it, but that museum is, it's the Vietnamese side of the war, the American war. And once I was the tour guide for that for a group of Americans from National Geographic, and very well-educated professionals. And at the end of it, they turned to me and they said, Elizabeth, was that all true about what America did? And I said, yes. There are no lies there, but this is a one-sided story. And George is going to go on with that. In Cambodia, you're more likely to have gone to something called the Tuol Sleng Museum. And you go to the Tuol Sleng, and that's the old torture center of the Khmer Rouge during their regime, Democratic Kampuchea, where thousands of people were falsely accused of non-existent crimes and killed as part of the government of terror, of getting rid of people they considered the enemies because they were afraid that they would lose power. And people go to that and they come back and said, how can Cambodians do that to Cambodians? Is that what the war was all about? And then I have the horrible problem of saying, no, that's not what all the war is about. And that's what I want to go over for the next 10 minutes. As Peter said, let's start at 1975. As he just said, the Marshall Plan that the United States created for World War II after World War II was humane, smart, strategic, giving development aid to all of Western Europe, including Italy and Western Germany, the former enemy, and offering aid to Eastern Europe. Contrast that with the United States at the end of the war in 1975. They turned their back on Indochina, took no responsibility, and quite officially, they still haven't taken responsibility. They'll give aid through government agencies, but it's not anything like a reparations. That sort of tells you, one, that they won World War II and they lost the Vietnam War, and two, this sort of what I'm going to describe as the atmosphere and a bit of very much the way that the United States behaved, particularly to Cambodia, after 1975. Now, we say the American-Vietnam War, it was one war fought in 3 countries. And that's very important because you can't understand what happened in Cambodia if you don't understand what the Vietnam War was about. Cambodia was the only country after the end of the colonial era to be in one piece. Wasn't divided. Laos and Vietnam were. There was no sanctuary for their very small communist group, the Khmer Rouge. None. They were in very good shape. Their leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the Democratic elected prime minister, wanted to remain neutral, didn't want to change that. And it worked from 1955 to 1970. Thailand had given over territory for air bases to Cambodia's west. You had to their east, of course, Vietnam, and to the north, Laos. They were surrounded by the war, and somehow he managed to pull it off. How? By remaining neutral, joining the non-aligned movement, and working deals. So in return for not being on the American side, the communists did not support the Khmer Rouge. Remember that. Their communist group was not supported directly by North Vietnam or China, and they were not very happy about it, but they did not have a real rebellion. They had incidences, but they were not supported. That changed in 1969. Richard Nixon was elected president, and one of the first things his national security advisor did, Henry Kissinger, was to approve the secret bombing of Cambodia, 1969. That secret bombing was the beginning of the end for the neutrality of Cambodia and dragging the country into war. The balance was gone by the rivals to Sihanouk saw an opening. The CIA had been trying to help get them to join, to overthrow Sihanouk anyhow. They overthrew him in 1970. There was a so-called invasion by the United States, and Cambodia was the last country to join the war. Now, why did the United States do that? Because they wanted out. They wanted to expand the battlefield so the American soldiers could be pulled out, and the Vietnamese communists who had used the border area as a Ho Chi Minh Trail could be neutralized. It backfired. The opposite happened. The North Vietnamese did not go back to North Vietnam. They went and took over half of Cambodia. Half of Cambodia. This country that didn't have anything like a real modern military, all of a sudden They were up against the North Vietnamese. They lost, and they refused to finally join the peace accords in 1973, January, which is like one of the key points here. What did the 1973 accords do for Cambodia? Essentially, it was a ceasefire, and the United States was able to withdraw their troops. The Cambodians had been treated so badly that they didn't join, and after the signing of it, the United States essentially unleashed all of their jets and bombers on Cambodia, and there was carpet bombing. And that's when I was a journalist in Cambodia, and I covered that. It's hard to duplicate what it's like to watch a country fall apart, but let's say that you never forget it. Within 2 years, the Khmer Rouge won. The Vietnamese won in Hanoi and in Laos later in December. So you have in Phnom Penh a Cambodian communist country called Democratic Kampuchea, which I will be lazy and continue to call Khmer Rouge, completely unqualified to run anything. Completely unqualified. Remember, they had not set up a government during any time. The North Vietnamese had taken help them with their winning the war, and all of a sudden they were in power. What did they do? They did what one of the more radical revolutions in history, throwing everybody out of the cities, turning the country into a labor camp, killing off the elite and the knowledgeable people. I'm using the translation of what they called them, the capable people, so that it was supposedly a classless society. In fact, it was a labor camp. There was executions, and the economy went to ruin, and the Khmer Rouge refused to accept any aid because they wanted to be self-sufficient. So this is hell. This is the first step after the war is hell. And this is, it's so unique, it's called autogenocide. The world was watching, the United States was appalled, brought cases at the UN Commission for Human Rights against them, and Cambodia decided that they were going to blame their former allies, the Vietnamese Communist government, for their problems. So they started a border war, 1977, 1978. December 1978, they came in and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, honestly believing that they would be applauded for this. Once again, I was there. Peter was my editor, and I was there just before they actually came into Phnom Penh. And I had seen the horrors of what they had done, and I was shocked, just like the North Vietnamese, and I mean like the Vietnamese or lots of others. The United States did a complete about-face. They said, no, 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 no. The Khmer Rouge should keep their seat at the UN, and with China, supported the Khmer Rouge with non-communist Cambodians to fight to regain the capital in Phnom Penh. This kicks off 10 years of war. Just think that over. 4 years of Khmer Rouge, then 10 years of conflict, largely in the west and northwest, where the punishing sanctions and trade embargoes on Cambodia meant that very little trade came in or very little food aid. A neutral position, which was argued by countries like Australia, were rejected out of hand. That decade of war matches the United States' stranglehold on Vietnam, and it cannot be separated because the United States had decided in their negotiations with Vietnam, which were very irregular, that Vietnam had to prove that they were doing all they could to retrieve the remains of missing in action Americans. And that was their main point. Then they decided that they would not have relations with Vietnam or lift the sanctions unless Vietnam left the country. This went on, as I said, for 10 years. Finally, the Vietnamese said, okay, we're leaving. They called our bluff, And all of a sudden, the United States, Europe, and the other countries were horrified that they would actually be caught supporting the Khmer Rouge return. That led, finally, in 1990 to 1990, a peace accord, and 1993, a UN peace elections and development of the country. Just think that over. I remember one of the quotes, and I wrote it down here somewhere, that just came out from all of this was when the United States was still supporting the Khmer Rouge in 1990, a congressman from Massachusetts named Chet Atkins said, "Enough of this policy of hatred. Over Cambodia, we're still fighting the Vietnam War." And it was true. Cambodia was, it was a Vietnam War. The elections were held. It's another sad chapter, but it's not a bad, sad chapter totally, but the healing began. Prince Ranariddh, the son of Sihanouk, won, and Hun Sen, the man who was initially put into the government by the Vietnamese, came in second. Like someone else we know, he refused to accept the election results and conned the UN into making a second position for him, Prime Minister number 2 to go with Prime Minister number 1. You can guess what happened. Before long, Ranariddh was overthrown, and he was in power ever since today. So I'll go back and end it this way. The United States started that war, first in 55, supporting Saigon when the French left, and all the way through to 75, on the premise that Vietnam had to be stopped from taking over all of Southeast Asia for communism. The only country that they took over was communist Cambodia. Secondly, the result of our amazing changes of cruel policy that proved to be so cruel for Cambodians was that the guy who the Vietnamese put in the first place still runs the country. However, there's been a lot of healing, there's been a lot of development, sadly, lots of awfulness as well, but just think of what was wasted in those more than 20 years of our policy.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Just right. My question to you is, can you wrap yourself, characterize Cambodia today? The population is double what it was at the end of the war. When you visit it, you're traveling through a country, for better or worse, at peace, with a functioning economy. I may be wearing a T-shirt that was made there, probably not. Can you characterize Cambodia 2024 as a country, as a place, and to the extent that we can, the people of Cambodia?
Totally, the government and the people, totally different. It's a modern feudal system, I'd say. It's run by the Khmer Rouge of corrupt business people who are around the Hun Sen family. They're pretty much no longer have, there's no opposition, no freedom of speech, but it gives you you come as a tourist and it looks, wow, this is a lovely country, it's recovered, it's beautiful, it is beautiful, the people are amazing. And if you don't look too closely, you'll say, oh, this is doing very well. But the corruption level is awful, and you see it, if you know the place very well, in the destruction of the environment, in the pollution, in the vast inequality that did not exist before, and the triggers that keep showing the world how bad they are. For instance, the last year or so, Cambodia has been in the news largely for trafficking in human people for those credit card scam things, and it's so shallow. What keeps it going is, I'll go back to the tool slang. The Cambodians still are terrified of what would happen if they rebel.
I keep wondering, for generations of people that come after the ghastly, absolutely ghastly Khmer Rouge years, how deeply do the Cambodians today, to the extent that we can judge, carry that as in their legacy, as their sense of themselves? That they would do that. Remember, this wasn't something others did to them. It's what they did to themselves. So how deeply do you think Cambodians can deal with the scale of brutality that the Cambodians imposed upon themselves?
It's deep, and we've had a couple of wonderful Khmer American authors who've written about it. There are studies, and there's no question that, as I said, it's the kids and the grandkids. It's part of what their story is. This is what happened. We don't know why, and they live with people whose families were the perpetrators, and the others were the victims. It was only there's a brief window when the UN was able to talk Cambodia into having a tribunal. And that was the first time, that's in the 21st century, finally, the country came to grips with a public tribunal of what the Khmer Rouge did, and the top leaders who were still living were tried. I testified at it.
I remember,
and, It was the most searing thing I've ever done in my life, to sit there and have to talk about what happened. That was huge because it confirmed what was nebulous. And finally, you have a real written history. It doesn't mean that the Cambodian government doesn't try to rewrite history on its own, but it was a marker, and it helped change what one hopes will eventually be a reversal. But finally, it was legitimate.
Excellent, thank you. Now, George, the thing striking about Vietnam today, country of 100 million people, as I recall, at one of Hang's, somebody said something like 70 million of them are on Facebook. Think about
The
that.
rest are on TikTok.
But the striking thing, given George's the substance, the content of his book, is the way in which the United States has somehow found a path to, I guess you would have to call it some sort of, it's not an alliance, it's not a friendship, but if you ask serious people in the American national security system, who can you trust in East Asia, Southeast Asia, the answer is Vietnam, which is, of course, an amazing irony. So George, the thesis of your book is basically how that happened. So would you talk a bit about how it happened that we went from being the country responsible for this scale of massive destruction for a purpose that in the end was pointless, to today's essentially, I would call it, traditional state-to-state relationship?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes.
I just came back from
You can do it in 9. Do it.
Well, she did it in 14. I was timing it. I might sneak in
She's
2
always
minutes.
written long.
Not true.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Hang, for putting this on. Thank you to the other panelists, and thank you all for coming. When the 10 to 11 minutes was specified, I thought how to do this. I just came back from a series of talks in Vietnam about my book, and I don't think any of them was less than an hour and a quarter, so Peter will discipline me. Elizabeth has done me a favor, actually, because she's set up a lot of the predicates of what I would want to discuss, sometimes quite specifically. I'll focus in on one place where I did give a talk to the staff and to the director, which was the War Remnants Museum. Those of you who have been to Vietnam almost certainly have been there. Those of you who will go to Vietnam in the future, it is the #1 tourist destination in the country, per capita, even more than Ha Long Bay. 1.3 million visitors a year, and they are now remodeling the museum in a way that is potentially radical. It is fraught with all sorts of political complications because it will be centered on a new permanent exhibit on U.S.-Vietnamese cooperation on the legacies of the war, on unexploded ordnance, on aid for disabilities, and on Agent Orange above all. The museum, you've got to remember, began life very, very shortly after what we here call the fall of Saigon and they there call the victory in 1975. The plan is to open this new permanent exhibit next April. And the director's view is that it will be focused for the majority, both for the majority of the visitors who are foreigners, about 85 or 90% of the people who visit the museum are foreigners, but also on a younger generation of Vietnamese. And one of the things that is always really striking and incongruous when you go to Vietnam and think about war legacy issues is the country is filled with museums about the war, monuments about the war, martyrs' cemeteries in every town, half of the graves saying unidentified. And yet, most Vietnamese appear to have, and I think quite deeply, have very little active memory or, in the case of younger Vietnamese, knowledge or even interest in the war. It's very much in the past. So the new remodeling, this permanent exhibit, will also be designed to target younger Vietnamese visitors. So when it began life, it was called the Exhibition House of American and Puppet War Crimes. It's now called the War Remnants Museum, which is the second name change. That in itself says a lot, but the exhibits to this day are still quite deeply rooted in the old language, the old set of imagery, none of which is inaccurate, but it is one side of the story. The interesting thing about the remodeling is it's being financed by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was extremely involved in the war effort. It had a permanent seat on the committee that planned Agent Orange herbicide targets, although it often dissented, to be fair, from what the military wanted. But as Elizabeth, as Elizabeth said, and Peter echoed, the peculiarity about Vietnam is in most wars, it's the winner that writes the post-war history, as in Germany, as in Japan. And to a large extent, for the first 10 or 12 years after the war in Vietnam, it was the losers who conditioned the terms of the post-war era: a suffocating economic embargo, denial of access to any kind of international funding or loans, and support for the Khmer Rouge government, and a further round of punitive attitudes following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. And that was exacerbated, to be fair and accurate, by the economic policies that were adopted by the Vietnamese themselves. I think when you talk to Americans, they still regard this as Ho Chi Minh's war. Ho Chi Minh was dead in 1969, and the controlling force in the Politburo from the early 60s, frankly, and often over Ho Chi Minh's opposition, was in the hands of a much more hardline faction of the Vietnamese Communist Party, led by a man called Le Duan. So this freeze, this deep freeze, lasted until two things happened, both of which have been alluded to. One was the Vietnamese exit from Cambodia. I use the word exit in inverted commas. And the other was the first cooperation on the search for American MIAs. And that issue dominated everything. The United States would not talk about anything until 1987. Until the point came when the Vietnamese realized they weren't getting anything out of that situation by not cooperating. And more importantly, in terms of the political weight brought to bear on the issue, the United States realized that the hard line wasn't getting people out. So you had the first issue of common interest. And the Vietnamese at the same time, Le Duan had just died in 1986. So there was for the first time the possibility and the deep interest in opening up the economy and the country to the world. And that all crystallized around 1989. First, cooperation on joint search missions for American missing in action, of whom, just to note quickly, there were 2,646. No one has any idea how many Vietnamese remain missing. The estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000. Nonetheless, you will not find a great deal of bitterness, even among many Vietnamese families who did lose people who I've interviewed and visited in their homes. Very little bitterness about that. On the contrary, a lot of gratitude for a new US program, very small scale, which is actually designed to help the Vietnamese finally recover their missing. So over the next, very briefly here, over the next, where are we, 1989 to the present, 34 years, the argument I make in the book is that the US reluctance to deal with these issues has been largely pushed by private citizens. Not only American, but quite significantly by Canadians. There was a lot of trust in Vietnam of the Canadians for various reasons, including the role of Canada in monitoring the terms of the 1954 settlement and partition of Vietnam at the end of the French War. And each of these groups that I describe in the book, who form, I always say, a kind of Venn diagram where they overlap, the American veterans who returned, the humanitarian aid workers who, in some cases, had worked in Vietnam during the war, and then the scientists who worked with the Vietnamese to unravel the question not only of how dioxin in Agent Orange worked and was transmitted through generations, but that it could be dealt with. There was a tremendous reluctance by the United States ever to deal with Agent Orange, even in many years after diplomatic relations were normalized. And what this scientific research established was that the remaining contamination from dioxin, which had been sprayed on a sixth of the land area, was actually contained to the areas around American military facilities where it had been stored and spilled. And the second thing is they discovered that even though there were hundreds of thousands or even millions of disabled Vietnamese, you could actually pinpoint the areas where people were most at risk. And to cut a very long story short, over time, those people have been targeted for direct and indirect US aid. The cleanup of the big air bases has involved much more money than the disability programs have, and it's been actually less politically fraught. And in the end, the cost of it was such. The first big one to be cleaned up was the air base at Da Nang in central Vietnam. That cost $116 million, paid for by USAID. The bigger one, the air base at Bien Hoa, just outside Saigon, could cost up to $1 billion, depending on how it goes, at least $600 million. And the scale of the funding was so great that USAID and the State Department said, look, this crashes our annual budget if we pay for this. And so the Pentagon, after a long and tortuous story, some of which I tell in the book, was pressed into contributing half of the initial cost, the first $300 million. And the key to that, I think, is that both sides progressively, through aid on all these issues, had established a basis of common interest and a certain amount of common trust. Bien Hoa is where the militaries came together formally, and the Pentagon really, for the first time, explicitly accepted responsibility. And the long and the short of it is that Peter alluded to the current relationship. Just about 5 months after my book came out last year, President Biden went to Hanoi and they signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, which actually now places the United States on the same basis of relationship with Vietnam as China and Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, their two main sponsors in the war. So the museum, which will be a wonderful, for those of you who go next year, around the time of the anniversary, it's scheduled to open sometime next year, hopefully for the April 30th anniversary. It'll be a wonderful window into how far that reconciliation has gone in retelling or reconsidering the official story of the war. And it will be a yardstick of how far the Vietnamese side is prepared to offer a new version of that history, especially since this is a US-funded exercise, US government-funded. There will be all sorts of complications. The plan, which is now in the design phase, pre-construction, has to be approved by the Ho Chi Minh City People's Committee, by the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and I can never remember the full name of it, and of course by the Vietnamese military, because dealing with war legacy issues is a military issue, and it will go through a military committee. The obstacle I see on both sides and how we proceed into the future is that the main architects of the cooperation over many years have been Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, now just retired, and General Nguyen Chi Vinh, the head of this military office on war legacies, who passed away prematurely last year in his 50s. So that leaves a great vacuum of the people who have led at a government level this effort that private citizens have pushed. So go to the museum next year and you will get a sense of how much has been accomplished and how much still remains to be done.
Well done, thanks. You know, one of the striking facts 50 years after the end of the war is that in this country, we're still coping with the morale issues that emanate from the war. The Vietnam syndrome in this country is very real. Our policies are framed in one way or another as a consequence of what happened in Vietnam, and the loss of confidence and trust in American leadership, which really began with the Vietnam War, has metastasized to the point that we're in now where nobody believes anything. By contrast, and this is the question I have for you, George, what is it about Vietnamese character that enables them, as you said, to have set bitterness aside, recognizing that they were treated, that the destruction was vast and the harm was vast? But it is very strange. Now, it could be because they won, in a sense.
That's part of it.
But what is it about Vietnamese character? Because one of the reasons why the war was such a catastrophe for the United States is because we truly did not understand anything about Vietnam. I just want to say something about Les Duan. I don't know if you saw the Ken Burns series. In episode 3 of the Ken Burns series, there's a tape of McNamara talking to Johnson. So this is 66. The Secretary of Defense is talking to the President of the United States. And he says, Mr. President, Ho Chi Minh has sort of been pushed aside up there in Hanoi. Oh, really? Yeah. There's a new guy who's really running the show. His name is Le Duan, Leduan. And I listen, I think, you mean the Secretary of Defense is telling the President of the United States who runs the enemy and has to spell his name? That's ignorance. So what is it about the Vietnamese character that enables them to overcome the sort of bitterness? They see it, they see the consequences of damage, and yet they've moved on.
It's the big question. It's the question that confronts every visitor. The first Vietnam veterans to go back were a group from all 4 branches of the military, led by Bobby Mueller, probably the most famous with John Kerry of the anti-war vets. They went back in 1981, and they were terrified. They thought people were going to stone us in the streets. And everywhere they went, walking around the streets of Hanoi, people were coming up saying, "You were in the war? Where were you? My father was in the war. Welcome." And that has been the attitude that every tourist encounters when they deal with Vietnamese, those that do, certainly all the veterans who have gone back. And I can't answer that question, Peter, any better than anyone else can. I don't know that there is any such thing as the national character, but there are certain traits. I have in the book an interview with a retired Vietnamese colonel from the People's Army who now works very closely with foreign groups doing UXO removal in Quang Tri province. And he just laughed at the question when I said to him, just tell me the damn reasons. Everywhere I go, you go to families of Agent Orange victims, kids who are now dying in middle age. You go to families of martyrs from the military, and you get none of that even from them, people who have suffered most directly at a human level. And he, in the end, he sort of joked. He said, well, maybe it's just the Oriental character you Westerners will never understand, which sounded like, Edward Said was back in the room talking to us about Orientalism. But, seriously, I mean, personally, and I think many people would ascribe a huge amount of this to Buddhism and the idea of what now in this country people call radical acceptance. There are the obvious answers. Yes, Vietnam won the war. America lost. And yet there's still no real punitive feeling about, again, trying to defeat the enemy. It's a long time ago, and there is a huge amount of dynamism that everyone sees in Vietnam, and that really began back in the 80s of, unleashing this younger generation, training them, educating them in technical skills, and they've been very, very successful at that. And the younger generation, as I said before, are still pretty ignorant of the war. But I think also there's a sense of community cohesion, which largely and more we lack in this country. And that has to do, again, with Buddhism. It has to do a certain amount with Confucianism, the strength of the family, the ancestors, the village, the community, the commune, where people really do pull together. I know a lot of younger Vietnamese who migrated to the cities in the 90s mainly when the economy really opened up. And a parent would die, so they returned to the ancestral village to be with their parents as they age. So I don't think there's a single answer to that question. It's remarkable, it's striking. I think it has many, many root causes. I would probably say of all of them that the depth of the Buddhist tradition, to me, is the most striking and consistent factor, but there are many others.
Good. So the story of Laos throughout Indochina's history is that it's third of three. The smallest, the most remote. Any one of us who got the chance to go to Vientiane during the war looked forward to it. Lovely. There were things about Vientiane that made visiting there particularly pleasant, some of which were against the law, I mean American law. I mean, I'm kidding. But interestingly, in 1962, there was an agreement to neutralize Laos. And people wondered at the time whether, is this the future of Indochina? A neutral Laos will lead to a neutral Vietnam and a neutral Cambodia. But that's, of course, not what happened. And Laos has always been, therefore, slightly subject to being appreciate's not the right word, undercovered, understood. So tell us a little bit in your presentation, which focuses on your personal experience using the term of unexplored ordnance. So tell us your personal sense of Laos and the consequences of being Laotian in the Great Indochina War.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to leave from behind so you all can see my towering figure. And I have a presentation, so there will be pictures. But let me just first echo, all of my co-panelists and Peter's thanks for Hang and the greater team here. Speaking for myself, I know what it's like to put on events, and it's a huge undertaking. So I hope that you will get tons of sleep and rest afterwards. And thank you all for being here, for choosing to be here today, and giving us your undivided attention. So I'll be sharing a little bit about my family story, linked to other stories, and many of which will be very hard to hear. But I'll tell it from the perspective of someone whose ancestors, whose family have been colonized, oppressed, subjugated, and bombed to death. Can you use the mic? So, so I can't move around. This is sorry. It's okay.
As always, Laos goes its own way.
Damn it. I mean, darn. So I'll be, just speaking unfiltered, unfiltered emotion, unfiltered truth, because for me, I think it's the only way for me to tell this story. So let me just, give you all some pictures first, so I won't have to interrupt myself in here. So this picture of the woman and the 4 children is myself and my siblings, and I'm the cutest one. So obviously the one in red, okay? And that picture of me stepping out of the plane was my first visit back to Laos in 2019 when I left for the first time visiting again. And the picture at the bottom of that cute little girl is 6-year-old me stepping off the plane in Washington, D.C. And this mainly is a photo of my father, Dr. Koulabdara, and my siblings, the brothers. My older sister was taking the photo, so she's always the one taking it for the team. So let me take you all back to when I was living in Laos. So I grew up in Laos, in the southern part, in Champasak province. So, Laos, of course, is a land-linked country in Southeast Asia. And for me, I feel like it's sort of the heart of Southeast Asia as a whole. Very little known, little understood, like Peter mentioned. But I grew up in Champasak province, and this is home to Wat Phu. So this is the mountain temple, translated into mountain temple. This temple predates its more iconic and famous cousin, Angkor Wat. It also predates Notre Dame Cathedral in France. So you know that this is an ancient place, and it's a highly revered site, Buddhist site, for many people living in Laos, including my own family. So when I was growing up, I used to hang out there a lot, run around with my siblings, chasing the goats and the notorious cats. And when we were, done playing, my grandmother would call us up to climb the steep steps. You can't really tell from this picture, but we would climb up this long steps in 90+ degree heat. So when we finally reached the top, my grandmothers would drench us in the holy water that's up there. So you guys know I'm extra blessed. And when we were all done, my grandmother would have us pray for the safe return of my mom and dad. So my mom and dad traveled all over Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. My father was a surgeon, and he worked on countless victims of UXO accidents. And my mother is a renowned seamstress, so she made my skirt. Used to be hers. We had it adjusted, do not have a 24 vase like my mom. But they would travel together and do this work and dedicate their lives to this. And when they would return home, my father and mother, I remember them talking about this. So growing up, UXO, unexploded ordnance, has been a huge, huge part of my life. And it was just something that was there that we never really questioned. And for the most part, I thought we were safe. I thought my neighborhood was pretty safe from it. And when we started going to school, what was taught to my siblings and I was to only walk on well-worn roads. To make sure that road that people typically took for years, those were the safe one. And for the most part, my siblings and I felt safe. Until one day, we came home from school, and there was loud banging and villagers were screaming for my father. We came out of the house, and there, laying in the front, was my classmate La. She encountered an accident. Her mother was wailing in anguish, and La was screaming in pain. My father was forced to amputate her leg in order to save her life. She was 5 years old. This happened in 1989. That following year, when I turned 6, my family was forced to flee Laos in order to prevent an accident or death happening to my family and I. We landed in Washington, D.C. I remember driving past the White House, the Pentagon, huge monuments, magnificent buildings. I was in awe of my new home, but I had no clue about the deep history that the United States had with my birth country of Laos and its surrounding neighbors, Vietnam and Cambodia. I had no idea that the United States dropped at least 13 million tons of ordnance on these 3 countries. On Laos alone, from 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped at least 2.5 million tons of ordnance during 580,000 bombing missions. That's an equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 long years. It earned Laos the most bombed country per capita in history. It earned Laos that title. A staggering 98% of the casualties were civilians. Now, even if you escape the war, even if you flee, and you somehow cross the strong currents of the Mekong River into Thailand, there's still so much more challenges that lay ahead for refugees. I'll share just a quick story. My father is the eldest of 9 children, and in order to get his siblings across, he had to figure out a way to earn enough money to get them across. 6 of the siblings were sisters. 2 of his sisters were separated from the group. My then 16-year-old and 17-year-old aunt. When they reached the border of Thailand, I think most of you are aware that Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, in general, very modest countries, right? Especially for women. My aunts never even changed clothing in front of their moms. They were forced to strip in front of 5 male guards to make sure that they didn't have anything on them. And then after that, they live in constant fear of being raped and fear that no country would allow them to get into the country for safety. So during that time, Laos's population was only about 2.2 million people. And due to the secrecy of the slaughter, we have limited data and documentation during this time period. So by our best estimate, roughly 20% of the people died. Another 25% fled, like members of my family. That's 25% of the population. So the atrocities that are committed in the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are no outliers. I pulled this list from the International Rescue Committee. This is only about 20 of crisis, wars happening all over the globe. We know that there's more. And the UN puts this at least 32 different recognized conflict and crisis happening all over. I would add Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam to this list because it still matters today, and that's why there's organizations like Legacies of War that exist, like War Legacies Project that exists, that tries to resolve these lingering legacies, right? So of the 13 million tons of ordnance that were dropped on the 3 countries, between 10 to 30 failed to detonate on impact, leaving millions of UXO or unexploded ordnance laying there dormant, waiting for potentially a 6-year-old child to trigger it or an animal walking by. And even if one life is impacted and at risk, I think that's a modern day emergency, and that's unacceptable. So I'm gonna go back to this slide. To date, since the end of the war, at least 200,000 people have become casualty. So that's 200,000 people that have been killed or injured due to these unexploded ordnance. And we have to continue to work hard at raising funds in order to remove them. So the actions like the indiscriminate bombing of known civilian targets in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and in what we're all witnessing today, Palestine-Israel war, stems from this inhumane and racist ideology. An ideology that has a logic that places different values on lives of different people, right? Based on things like different of skin color, different of religion, things that are different. And it makes it okay. It makes it okay to colonize, subjugate, oppress another group of people. It makes it okay to say that these types of people are unworthy of our empathy, unworthy of the basic human lives to live. And that's not okay. And I believe we must hold our leaders and international leaders accountable for their actions or inactions. I'll leave you with this last story. This is an image that's part of a collection that Legacies of War is honored to hold. It's images that are written or illustrated by victims fleeing the bombings themselves in Laos. This is the only surviving primary source documentation from the time. This particular one is haunting to me. It's illustrated by a 16-year-old child who witnessed their school being burned to the ground with classmates and teacher inside. And the bombing in Laos would have continued had it not been, in part, due to 2 brave gentlemen, Fred Brampman and Bun Nguyen Long Pasert, and the millions of Americans who protest, and millions of people all over the world who stood in solidarity and said enough. So Fred and Bun Nguyen collected and smuggled these illustrations back to the United States. And in 1971, he testified in front of Congress and exposed the CIA, the US Air Force, and the president's secret bombing in Laos. 2 years later, the bombing ceased. And in 2016, then President Barack Obama became the first sitting US president to visit Laos and acknowledge the United States' role. He also announced a historic funding for Laos at $90 million divided up into 3 years. Now, my friends, these did not just miraculously happen. This took years and years of advocacy efforts due to part of Legacies of Wars, our partners and our supporters all around the world. It took over a decade for this to happen. Now, while this is historic and it's a lot of money, It is not even half a drop in the bucket. It costs the United States of America, in today's dollar, $16 million a day to bomb Laos for 9 straight years. So this is not enough, and our work is not done. Today, I am so proud that Legacies of War is 20 years old, and we kept the momentum strong, and we advocate for global humanitarian demining. And to the latest amount, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam currently receive 73 million US dollars for humanitarian demining, victims assistance, and explosive risk education. But that is not enough when all 63 provinces of Vietnam is contaminated. Less than 10% of the contamination in Laos has been cleared. And less than 15%, at least 15% of Cambodia's agricultural land is still contaminated. So we must continue to fight for it, and we cannot stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So within the confines of our schedule, are there questions that people want to ask? And please raise your hand if you have a question, and so we'll probably stay with questions and rather than go to the panelists because they've had their chance. So back there's a hand raised, please. Yeah. That's a good question. All right. Elizabeth, I'm sure you have an answer.
There's no question that we expected a peace dividend after the wall fell, and it looked like the antagonism would between the communist world and our world would end, the capitalist world. That didn't happen, and it is true that the United States military presence did in fact increase around the world. But however, to say, when you read the Pentagon Papers, there's no question that it was built on the idea that there was a communist conspiracy and that Vietnam was going to take over all of Southeast Asia, and it didn't happen. So that's fact.
Okay. George, you want to?
Well, yeah, I'll just say a word about veterans. American veterans have played a really fundamental role in what I tried to describe in Vietnam. And one thing to bear in mind, we have transitioned in the last 50 years from the ostracism of Vietnam veterans whose families, wives, girlfriends just did not know what to do with them. The American government had no interest in talking about them, addressing their concerns. But the interesting thing is when you look at the history of warfare, if you start with Drew Gilpin Faust's book on the Civil War, Death in the Civil War, Republic of Suffering, if you were shot, gut shot in the Civil War, you were dead. There was no battlefield medicine. Progressively, as wars continued, battlefield technology, medical technology, rapid response capacity has increased to where in Vietnam, the proportion who survived was much greater. Americans would be medevaced out of combat areas often within minutes. Since then, if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, the technology, the medical capacity is now so enormous that our VA hospitals, which are out of sight, out of mind, are filled with people who would never have survived even in Vietnam, with catastrophic brain injuries, with other massive injuries from which they'll never recover. And so we've transitioned in the case of the veterans of our wars from disdain and ostracism to this kind of rote thank you for your service rubbish, which doesn't actually deal with the reality of the veterans because we don't see them. And I think in every war you have to bear those people who served as you did and went through the consequences. You know, they should not exist out of sight and out of mind.
Question. Sir.
I would like to ask the journalists here, just maybe to speculate. The U.S. was in Vietnam before we had the 24/7 news cycle and cable and CNN and the others came along. Do you think that the U.S. involvement in Vietnam would have lasted as long if we had had that 24/7 news cycle in effect at the time? Or would public opinion have just turned so quickly against the war that we would have gotten out?
Well, yeah, I mean, all of us who have tried to cover the war and its aftermath, I guess, will have a view on this. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that there were things that were happening. There's an incident that I describe in my book where a young American captain, army captain, who is supervising South Vietnamese forces, training South Vietnamese forces and indigenous irregular forces, right on the Laos border at a critical point on the Ho Chi Minh Trail called the A Shau Valley. And he describes in his memoirs burning villages by setting fire to them with Zippo lighters. That was at the beginning of 1963. Name was Colin Powell. When Morley Safer of CBS News showed the image of Marines setting fire to a village near Da Nang in 1965, it caused a major eruption. It was really one of the first triggers, I would say, of the serious anti-war movement in 65. So yeah, if we'd had cameras in there 3 years previously, and as the other gentleman said, you know, I would say this doesn't just go back to 54, it goes back to 45, 46. And the decision, given the choice between supporting the decolonization of the world, which was happening everywhere, the British were pulling out of India, all the imperial powers were pulling out of their territories except for France. And France had been the loyal ally in World War II. And given that choice, the Truman administration made the decision to throw in its lot with the French. It all goes back to 45. And we obviously, no one was paying attention at that point. I don't think one soldier in 100 who went to Vietnam could have put it on a map. And as Peter said earlier, you know, the ignorance of what the politics were on the other side. First law of warfare, Sun Tzu, know your enemy, and we never did. And TV would have changed that, I think, earlier on.
Do you want to take a crack at this?
Yeah, rather than just 24/7, what was important about Vietnam is that it was the first and last openly covered war. That means that there was no censorship. If you had a press card and you could go anywhere. And that was the most significant part. And after that, after we were allowed to go everywhere, from then on, the U.S. military policy was no more open. It was embedding, which is a very strong controlling agent. So I would argue that 24/7 would have been a more shallow coverage, that you had a lot more in-depth in Vietnam. It took a while, but you had amazing reporting over the years. And then the other thing that would be part of my coverage point would be that these were soldiers who were drafted, and these were soldiers who were much more open to talking to the press. And every reporter who covered that war will tell you that, when you're in Saigon, they wouldn't talk to you, or you're in Phnom Penh or wherever, but you go out in the field and the average soldier will talk to you, and that disappeared as well.
Let me come to answer it in a slightly different way. The Vietnam War, the civil rights movements, the other social movements, anti-war movement, human rights movements, one of the astonishing consequences of the Vietnam War was the way in which public opinion, public activity, public engagement was able to change things. Vietnam, the Vietnam Indochina wars, whatever the media did, the trajectory was to a very large extent because of the popular movements in this country, Americans who lined up themselves. It happened in civil rights, it happened in the anti-war movement, it happened generally in the peace movement, it happened in all the other social movements. Do not underestimate the degree to which it's not the media, it's not the government, it's us. It's 11:30. One more question?
how many people are there today in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam who are suffering from the wounds of war, including exposure to Agent Orange?
We didn't have, there's no Agent Orange in Cambodia.
Well, maybe there was a little Agent Orange in
But
Cambodia, but
very
that's another
little,
story. There certainly was in Laos, and I want to recognize somebody who's here today, Susan Hammond, who in many ways, she's a significant character in my book, but also in many ways bookends the work that Sera has done on unexploded ordnance. Susan has concentrated on Agent Orange, including the very large-scale use of Agent Orange in Laos in total secrecy. It's impossible to answer the question of how many people. The Vietnamese Red Cross many, many years ago put out an estimate of 3 million disabled by Agent Orange. That has kind of made its way, in a sense, into the folklore that there are still 3 million people sickened. The figure is more likely in the high hundreds of thousands in terms of people directly disabled or with birth defects, and of course countless people who died many years ago invisibly of cancers and other diseases. At some level, the other way to answer that question is that everyone in Vietnam, south or north, everyone was touched by this war in a way that probably has no precedent in Western societies, even, where I grew up in post-World War II Britain. Yeah, you could make a case that everyone was touched in some ways, but often just because, a father, a brother had served, not necessarily because the human consequences had touched them. But it's very hard to find a Vietnamese family whose lives were not significantly disrupted by the war, and still are, even if they don't particularly focus on that.
I'm going to close it out, but one thing to remember is that the GIs who were in one way or another impacted by Agent Orange, there was a lawsuit eventually settled in which the money was spent, millions of dollars as far as I can recall, to give the people who, the United States GIs, the American GIs who had suffered as a result, some compensation. That was not done with reparations in either Cambodia or Vietnam, although it turns out we've been spending a certain amount of money. Listen, this was fascinating, and I want to thank you all, and certainly thank the panelists. We covered a lot of ground in a relatively short space of time. Thank you all.
Thank you.